Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Cambridgeshire. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the year 1901, the village of Holme stood quiet beside the fenlands, its church spire cutting into a sky the colour of tarnished silver. It was here that Clara and Eliza Merrin were born, twin daughters of a modest farmer who tended the last of his ancestral acres. The Merrin family had always kept to themselves. Their name appeared sparsely in the parish registers and once briefly in the Peterborough Chronicle's listing of rural baptisms. Nothing about them suggested tragedy, and yet the events that unfolded after their wedding in the spring of 1901 would forever mark Holme's history with a quiet stain. The sisters had long been regarded with a kind of fearful fascination. They were identical in face yet opposite in temperament, Clara steady and reserved, Eliza prone to long silences and sudden laughter. When a travelling carpenter named Thomas Red approached their father seeking employment, he also found himself drawn into the peculiar symmetry of their lives. The old vicar, Reverend Bexley, later wrote in his ledger that the union of one man and two mirrored hearts would invite discord of a moral order. The villagers whispered that it was less a marriage and more an arrangement of obsession. The wedding took place on a dull May afternoon under the heavy eaves of St. Agnes Church. Witnesses recalled the uncanny stillness that fell as the vows were read. A faint wind moved through the pews, stirring the candle flames though no door had opened. One photograph survives, showing the three figures, Thomas between the sisters, their hands clasped over his own. The faces are blurred at the edges, a trick of early exposure perhaps, or something less easily explained. For 3 weeks, the trio was seen living at the Merrin farmhouse. Then, without warning, they vanished. No letters were sent, no farewell given. A constable's note dated June 10th records, house found in order, fireplace cold, doors locked from inside. No sign of departure save 2 sets of shoes by the threshold. The parish assumed they had moved north for work, though the silence that followed grew heavy enough to trouble even the most sceptical. By August, Reverend Bexley filed a notice with the local magistrate, citing unaccountable absence and probable misadventure. A search of the surrounding fields turned up only fragments, a torn ribbon, a broken comb and an envelope addressed to Mrs. Red, never posted. The Peterborough Chronicle mentioned the case once more that year, calling it a vanishing of uncommon nature, and from that moment Holmes ceased speaking of the Merrin sisters. The farmhouse stood empty, its windows shuttered, the garden overgrown. Only one man claimed to have seen them again, a shepherd named Holme, who swore under oath that on a fog-laden dawn he saw 3 figures walking toward the churchyard, silent, with their veils trailing in the mud. His statement was dismissed as drink-borne fancy, though the note still rests in the county record book, the ink pale but legible. By autumn of that same year, the fields around Holme had turned to mud and frost, and the Merrin farmhouse became a landmark of unease. Children dared one another to touch its gate at dusk, while adults crossed the lane rather than pass its door. The constabulary maintained that the case was closed. The disappearance filed under domestic elopement, but locals whispered of candlelight seen through the boarded windows and faint singing carried over the fen. A single constable, Sergeant Wilkes, returned once in November to examine the grounds. His report, preserved in the county archive, described no prints in the soil, no intrusions through glass or wood, yet air within heavy, like the inside of a tomb. The Reverend Bexley began recording his unease in letters to a colleague in Ely, noting the uncanny stillness of the churchyard and the continued absence of birds near the Merrin plot. One of his letters references a curious entry in the Peterborough Chronicle regarding other twin disappearances in neighbouring parishes, though the connection remains speculative. There appears, he wrote, a thread of likeness between these vanishings, each preceded by a union or binding of a spiritual nature. In late December, an itinerant tinker named Caleb Horne knocked at the vicarage claiming to have found an abandoned trunk near the old mill. Inside were articles of women's clothing, a cracked photograph plate, and a marriage license bearing the names Clara Merrin and Thomas Red. Nothing of Eliza. The date, however, was smudged, perhaps by moisture, perhaps deliberately. Horne was detained briefly for questioning but released. He left the county 2 days later and was never heard from again. The recovered photograph plate was studied by a local chemist, Dr. Alfred Lyle, who noted a faint secondary exposure, a dark shape human in form, standing behind the primary subjects, though no such figure appears in the witness sketches of that day. Lyle's findings were dismissed as flawed technique, yet the plate was quietly removed from record and placed in the parish chest. By the first thaw of 1902, new owners had taken possession of the Merrin land. During renovations, they unearthed an old well beneath the floorboards of the rear room. It was dry, but its walls bore scratch marks and what appeared to be remnants of fabric pressed into the crevices. No formal investigation followed. The county coroner merely recorded, "No human remains present," and ordered the well sealed again. Those who worked the renovation, masons and a single apprentice, later refused to speak of what they saw. One, a man named Gibbons, told a tavern keeper that, "It wasn't the depth of that pit that chilled me, but the feeling that something looked back." He left home within the week. The story began to fade from record, yet for those who kept parish books, the gaps remained too neat. Each mention of the Merrin name had been blotted in ink, each corresponding line rewritten in a different hand. The Reverend himself ceased preaching that spring, retiring abruptly to his sister's home in Ely, where he lived out his remaining years in quiet seclusion. By the spring of 1903, the case of the Merrin sisters had all but disappeared from conversation, buried beneath new gossip and the slow rhythm of rural life. Only fragments persisted in official record: the incomplete affidavit of Sergeant Wilkes, the blurred photograph, the coroner's brief notation of the sealed well. But in nearby villages, rumours began to take on the form of folklore. Farmhands spoke of the twin brides of Holme, women said to wander the fen paths when the moon sank low, trailing ribbons through the mist. The accounts were dismissed as superstition, yet they spread widely enough to draw attention from the county's new constable, Mr. Edwin Corrow, who reopened the file in quiet defiance of his superiors. Corrow's notes, preserved in a private archive, reveal a methodical but troubled man. He spent several evenings interviewing the villagers who had last seen Thomas Red. Most described him as polite but peculiar, given to long absences and a habit of sketching in small notebooks. His employer, a millwright in Huntingdon, stated that Red had inquired about ground measurements and private cellars months before the marriage. What he intended was unclear. One torn ledger page recovered from the mill house bore the faint outline of a floor plan labelled "Below the Hearth." Corrow's investigation led him to revisit St. Agnes Church, where the Reverend's successor, a young curate named Mr. Yule, reported strange sounds beneath the nave. Late one evening, Yule heard what he described as a soft knocking, rhythmic and deliberate, from under the floor near the altar. The following morning he found a patch of disturbed mortar and, beneath it, a hollow space roughly the size of a coffin. Nothing was inside. No bones, no cloth, only a length of rusted chain and a wedding band engraved with the initials TR. The curate, unsettled, replaced the stone and made no formal record. Yet his private letter to a colleague in Peterborough survives, copied later in the Peterborough Chronicle as part of its collection of rural hauntings. By midsummer, Corrow's persistence had become an embarrassment to the constabulary. He was ordered to abandon the inquiry. His final entry reads, "Case closed by instruction. Local sentiment uncooperative. Evidence contradictory. Advise future custodians to let the dead rest." Shortly thereafter, he left the county altogether. Still, the story did not end in the records. In October of 1903, a travelling photographer named Gideon Platt stopped overnight at Holme on his way to Wisbech. In his possession were several glass negatives showing the church and its grounds. When developed, one image revealed, at the far edge of the frame, two faint figures standing near the church gate, dressed in white, their faces indistinct. Platt, who prided himself on precision, noted, "No one stood there when I took it." The photograph circulated briefly among local papers before being withdrawn without explanation. It was said that a man claiming to represent the county archives purchased it for a modest sum and destroyed the negative. Yet a single print remains, kept under glass in the Ely Historical Room, labelled only Unverified Exposure, 1903, St. Agnes. Winter came early in 1904, the kind of season that pressed the fog so low across the fenlands that lanterns burned pale even at noon. It was during this time that the last official mention of the Merrin case appeared in any surviving county register. A routine census check recorded, "Property abandoned, no trace of lawful occupants." That phrase, clinical and cold, marked the final bureaucratic trace of the Merrin name. Yet something about the affair continued to linger in the air. A quiet distrust of the churchyard after dusk, a hesitation in conversation whenever the name Red was heard. The Reverend Bexley's replacement, young Ewell, began compiling a private index of peculiar parish events. Among them, he included notes of parishioners claiming to hear voices from beneath the church floor, sometimes in the early hours of Sunday morning before service. He described them as soft, feminine, repeating syllables impossible to discern, fading as though receding into earth. Ewell confided to his journal that the discovery of the wedding band had never left him, and he feared he had entombed something that should have been named or blessed. In one entry, he cites the Peterborough Chronicle once more, referring to its accounts of restless unions and bridal oaths broken by death. Meanwhile, the land itself began to change. The farm where the Merrins once lived was sold to an investor from Leicester, who intended to rebuild the property for rental. The workmen's accounts note tools going missing overnight, and horses refusing to pass the south gate after dark. One worker, James Prothero, wrote a brief statement claiming that he saw a woman in a wedding veil, standing at the edge of the property near the willows, silent and unmoving. When he called out, the figure turned away and stepped into the fog. No tracks were found the next morning, and the foreman instructed all future crews to leave by dusk. In early 1905, the old well beneath the farmhouse collapsed inward, creating a cavity large enough to swallow a portion of the new foundation. The builder petitioned the county for inspection but was denied. Private expense, private concern. The debris removed from the pit included fragments of stained glass, a buckle and what one mason described as bones of small animals, arranged deliberate. No record of these items exists beyond his brief note in a local paper. For a few years the story waned again. Yet visitors who came through Holme remarked upon the sense of isolation that clung to its narrow lanes. One diarist, a schoolmistress travelling from March to Peterborough, recorded, "The air there is quiet but weighted, as if the ground itself remembers more than it should." She stayed one night at the vicarage and claimed to dream of twin faces behind the church glass, mouths open, eyes unblinking. When she mentioned it to Reverend Ewell the next morning, he answered softly, "Many here dream the same, though none speak of it twice." By the summer of 1906, the Church of St. Agnes had grown weathered, its bell rarely rung except for funerals. Reverend Ewell had begun showing signs of exhaustion, often pausing mid-sermon as if struggling to find breath. In one of his remaining letters, later recovered from diocesan storage, he wrote, "This parish feels haunted not by ghosts, but by memory itself." He made passing mention of the Peterborough Chronicle again, noting how its chroniclers once described whole villages that sank beneath silence when truth could no longer be spoken aloud. He seemed to believe Holme was such a place. That same year, the new tenant of the Merrin farmstead, a widow named Mrs. Armitage, filed a complaint with the constable about strangers seen walking near her property at night. She described two women in light dresses who would appear briefly by the boundary fence and vanish when hailed. When officers searched the area, they found the ground unbroken, save for one set of footprints that ended abruptly beside the north hedge. Mrs. Armitage left the property before harvest and took residence in March. Her statement, entered in faded ink, concluded, "I never saw their faces, only the shape of the veils moving though there was no wind." In September, the local sexton discovered the side door of St. Agnes standing open. Inside, the nave smelled strongly of damp earth. Near the altar rail, a small mound of soil had appeared overnight, no larger than a child's grave. Ewell recorded the finding in his private journal and swept the earth into a bucket himself, pouring it out by the church wall. Within a week, the same mound reappeared, this time with a torn length of white cloth pressed into it. The Reverend burned the cloth in the rectory stove, but told no one beyond a single confidant, the parish clerk, who later testified that the fabric reeked faintly of roses. Across Cambridgeshire, Railway expansion was bringing new faces into forgotten towns. Among them was a civil engineer named Harold Dent, who took temporary lodging near Holme while surveying land for a planned spur line. His field notebook, now kept in the county museum, mentions the unsettling quiet of the fen air, the absence of birds, and the rumour of twin brides. Dent's entries stop abruptly after 3 nights. His belongings were collected from the inn. He was never reported missing, but no further trace of him appears in census or payroll. By winter, Ewell's health had worsened. He ceased holding evening services and allowed the church bell to remain silent. Parishioners noticed his increasing habit of standing before the chancel floor in prayer, long after the building emptied. One note among his final papers reads simply, "If they are to be found, it will not be above ground." His handwriting trembles near the end of the line, as though written in haste or fear. When the year closed, frost sealed the fields once more. Fen St. Agnes stood as it had at the beginning, aloof, heavy-shouldered, guarding its silence over the fen. And beneath that silence, the story of the twin brides waited, patient as soil. The spring of 1907 brought a rare spell of warmth to the fenlands, and for a time Holme seemed to breathe again. The fields turned green, children returned to play near the church, and even the parish fair resumed after a 5-year silence. Yet beneath this surface renewal lay something uneasy, a collective reluctance to mention the past aloud. When strangers asked about the Merrin family, locals gave polite, incomplete answers, moved north or married away. Few believed it, but none cared to challenge the lie. Among the few who still cared was Mr. Corot, the former constable. He returned briefly to the area that summer, travelling under no official commission. His diary, later recovered from a second-hand bookshop in Norwich, provides one of the last first-hand accounts of the case. "The church," he wrote, "stands like a keeper of things unspoken. Even the grass grows inward, curling toward the stones." He visited the Merrin farmhouse, now a ruin, and noted the faint outline of 3 footprints preserved in the dry earth near the back wall. 2 small, 1 larger, all facing away from the door. He described the pattern as fresh though the soil is long undisturbed. Corot spent 3 nights lodging in Holme and 1 at the rectory with Reverend Ewell. Their conversation, transcribed in Ewell's private papers, turned to the Peterborough Chronicle, which Corot had apparently consulted before his visit. He remarked on the Chronicle's curious passage about twin bonds in the fen parishes, stories of sisters or kin who vanished together following disputes of inheritance or marriage. "You see," Corot told him, "it isn't new. The land repeats what it remembers." Ewell's reply was simple, "Then God help us, for it remembers too well." The night after that meeting, a storm broke over the fens. The rectory roof was struck by lightning, though no fire followed. Ewell claimed the thunder shook the floor beneath his bed, as though something beneath the earth was stirring. The next morning, Corot had already departed, leaving behind his travel coat and a sealed envelope addressed only, "For whom it may concern." Its contents were never publicly revealed. Weeks later, a shepherd driving his flock near the church spotted a man's hat half buried in mud by the drainage ditch. Inside was a faded label stitched with the name E. Corot. No body was recovered. The constabulary listed the incident as accidental drowning, though the ditch was barely 2 feet deep. That autumn, villagers began hearing a strange echo in the churchyard at dusk, a soft tapping sound that came and went with the wind. Children imitated it by drumming sticks on the gate, calling it the knock of the brides. Parents forbade the game, but the name remained. By the year's end, Reverend Ewell's final sermon spoke of repentance not as sin forgiven, but as memory faced. "There are things we bury," he said, "that continue to breathe beneath the soil." He died of pneumonia before the next spring thaw. His successor, upon cleaning the rectory, found a sealed drawer in his study, containing only a key labelled cellar, St. Agnes, do not use. The arrival of Reverend Harcourt in early 1908 marked the final chapter of the church's documented history regarding the Merrin affair. Harcourt was younger than his predecessor, pragmatic by nature, and determined to dispel what he called the mists of rustic superstition. His first act was to renovate the rectory, sealing drafts and repainting walls. His second was to reopen the church cellar that had been locked for nearly a decade. Parishioners advised against it, claiming the key Ewell left behind was better left untouched. Harcourt ignored them. When the door was pried open, the air that escaped was thick and foul. Inside, the cellar was bare stone except for what Harcourt described in his letter to the diocesan office as a length of fabric pinned beneath a loose flagstone, resembling the hem of a bridal veil. He burned it in the yard that same evening and recorded in his log that the act restored a sense of order. But that night, several villagers reported the church bell ringing on its own just past midnight. The following week, Harcourt summoned 2 stonemasons from March to reinforce the cellar. One of them, a man named Ives, later told the coroner that while working near the foundation, he uncovered a set of initials carved faintly into the stone, CM and EM. The second mason claimed to see a third set below it, nearly erased TR. They reported this to Harcourt, who ordered the area plastered immediately. Within days, both men had left the county. Around this time, the Peterborough Chronicle briefly revived public curiosity when it printed an article about the Brides of Holme, a parish mystery reconsidered. It summarized the known facts and made careful reference to earlier folklore, suggesting that the twins' disappearance reflected a persistent local motif of union and silence. Harcourt dismissed the piece as gossip, but the print drew visitors from nearby towns, eager to see the church where the so-called phantom brides had last been seen. For a month, Holme filled with outsiders carrying sketchbooks and cheap cameras. Then in April, the influx ceased. One visitor, a writer from Ely named Mr. Prentice, vanished after leaving the inn at dusk. His bicycle was found propped against the church gate, its lamp still burning. In his rented room, police discovered several pages of notes describing the fens as a place where sound carries further than light. Among his effects was a torn photograph sleeve bearing the faint outline of 3 figures, 2 pale and 1 darker behind. Reverend Harcourt, shaken but resolute, held a prayer service for the missing man and declared the grounds off limits thereafter. He also requested that all parish records before 1901 be transferred to diocesan custody for preservation. They were never catalogued again. By year's end, only the elderly spoke of the Merrin twins, and even then in lowered voices. When asked, one old farmer said simply, "They were good girls, but they shouldn't have shared." The remark, scribbled in a later ethnographic note by a Cambridge folklorist, remains one of the last first-hand recollections tied to their names. The fog returned that winter, thicker than ever recorded, and Holme once again disappeared from passing maps, its roads marked as seasonally impassable. The few travellers who did find their way through claimed the church bell still tolled, faint and uncertain, from somewhere beneath the ground. By early 1909, St. Agnes stood almost forgotten. The church roof had begun to sag, and ivy crept over its north wall like veins reclaiming a corpse. Reverend Harcourt, though steadfast, was said to have grown pale and sleepless. He wrote to a diocesan surveyor that something in this soil resists restoration. Each repair is undone overnight as though by invisible hands. His letters show a man wavering between faith and dread, yet he persisted in cataloguing each odd occurrence with the precision of an archivist. That winter, a scholar from Cambridge, Dr. Lionel Kerr, visited to inspect parish manuscripts. He specialized in regional folklore and had written essays citing the Peterborough Chronicle as one of England's earliest ethnographic sources. Kerr intended to verify whether the Merrin legend predated the actual marriage. He interviewed aging villagers who remembered the sisters as pale but kind, and one, Agnes Dorr, then 80, claimed she'd seen them the night before the wedding, walking by the reeds, each holding a candle that would not go out in the wind. Kerr dismissed it as embellishment, yet noted how consistent such images were across testimonies. He stayed 3 nights at the rectory, copying records by lamplight. On the 4th morning he departed for Ely, leaving behind a single page on Harcourt's desk. There is a pattern of duplication, faces, names, even entries in the ledger repeated as if by unseen hand. Kerr died the following year of influenza. His notes never published. In March 1909, 2 choirboys cleaning the belfry found an old trunk wedged behind the ladder. Inside lay bridal shoes, stiff with age, and a folded document. part of the original marriage register torn neatly along the spine. Harcourt examined it privately. The surviving fragment contained only half the record. Eliza Merrin, united before God to... The groom's name missing, the ink scoured away. He locked the fragment in his desk and told the boys they'd found nothing of worth. Spring turned cold again, and with it came a series of fires across the fen parishes. Sheds, barns, even one rectory stable burned without clear cause. Holme escaped the worst, though on several mornings the churchyard grass appeared singed in perfect circles, as though candles had been placed there overnight. Harcourt blamed vagrants and ordered the grounds watched, but no one volunteered after dark. The sexton resigned, muttering that he'd seen 3 shadows moving between graves when there were only 2 stones. By midsummer, Holme's few remaining families began attending service in neighbouring villages. Harcourt continued preaching to empty pews, his sermons reduced to murmured fragments of prayer. A visiting clerk from Peterborough later wrote that he found the man standing at the altar rail whispering, "One was promised, the other was owed." Within weeks, Harcourt left the parish without notice. His replacement found his notes burned in the hearth, save for one scrap that read, "If they ever stood apart, the land itself would remember which side each belonged." The last formal entry in the church book that year was a simple line in red ink, "Sanctuary closed until further repair." After that, St. Agnes was abandoned to the reeds and the wind. No more weddings were held in Holme. No bells rang again. By 1910, Holme existed as little more than a name on county maps. The railway had diverted north, and travellers no longer passed through its sodden lanes. The church roof had caved in by inches, letting in strips of light that cut the nave into bars of dust. Local herders claimed the sheep refused to graze near the church boundary, turning back without cause. The air there felt, as one wrote, thicker than weather, like breath already used. That spring, a field agent named Robert Kells was dispatched to assess the ruins for possible reclamation. His brief report, preserved in the county archive, described the site as partially submerged, unfit for habitation, but the closing paragraph has long puzzled historians. Notable within the chancel, 2 depressions in the earth side by side, approximate in size to burial plots, though unmarked and unregistered. Soil shows signs of disturbance within the last decade. The report was initialed but unsigned. No follow-up inspection occurred. Months later, a small feature appeared in the Peterborough Chronicle, penned by a junior correspondent summarising the lost villages of the fen. Among the entries was Holme, described as a parish erased more by forgetting than by flood. The article repeated fragments of the twin brides legend, the shared groom, the vanished procession, the sightings near the church wall, and concluded with the line, "The land keeps their vows when men will not." The phrasing, poetic and ambiguous, reignited interest among amateur historians and folklorists, some of whom began visiting the ruins in search of evidence. One such visitor, Miss Beatrice Lowe, a lecturer in antiquities at Girton College, compiled detailed sketches of the site. In her surviving notebook, she describes patterns in the floor dust forming rings, as if 2 figures had once stood there and turned slowly upon the spot. Her last entry, dated September 2nd, 1910, reads simply, "He was here first. The other still watches from the wall." No explanation follows. She was found days later at her lodging in Cambridge, bedridden with fever, muttering incoherently about veils moving without hands. She recovered physically, but never resumed her field work. By winter, a succession of trespassers stripped the church of its usable stone. One cart driver reported that, while loading bricks near the apse, he heard the sound of water beneath his feet, though the ground was dry. Startled, he dropped his lantern, shattering it. The fragments of glass were later found arranged in a perfect oval. He refused further payment and left the job unfinished. The parish boundary eventually blurred into neighbouring farmland. Maps of 1912 omit Holme entirely, labelling the area as fen waste. Yet travellers at dusk occasionally spoke of seeing faint candlelight across the reeds, always 2 flames side by side, and a third that lingered behind them, dimmer as if waiting. Locals began calling them the wedding lights. It was around this time that the last of the Merrin line, a cousin named Jonathan living in St. Ives, petitioned to have the family plots officially closed. His letter ends, "Let their names rest. Too many have gone looking. The registrar obliged. The final mark beside the Merrin entry was a thin black cross. After that, the ledger fell silent, and so too did Holme. In the early months of 1911, surveyors mapping drainage improvements for the northern fens noted Holme only as site of derelict church. The official record stopped there, but diaries and private letters from that period reveal more than the bureaucratic silence suggests. One of the engineers, a Scotsman named Arthur Bell, wrote to his wife that he'd seen the ruins of a chapel standing crooked in the fog, yet the bell still hung as if waiting. He described 2 swans drifting along the flooded lane, each trailing a line of white silk ribbon that disappeared beneath the water. When he returned the next morning, both ribbons were gone. By this point, the Peterborough Chronicle had ceased publication, its final issue lamenting the loss of many parish records in a warehouse fire. Still, its legend persisted. A generation of local historians relied upon it as the only surviving source connecting the Merrin disappearance with other fen mysteries. Dr. Lionel Kerr's unfinished essays, posthumously printed in a small academic journal, made one last mention of Holme, calling it an enclave where the living and the recorded seem to overlap. That summer, a farmer ploughing near the old Merrin acreage uncovered the corner of a wooden box wedged deep in peat. Inside lay 2 rings, both identical, bearing the initials CM and EM. The corroded metal was traced to a local jeweler active in the 1890s, but the shop had long since closed. The farmer handed the box to the constable in March and refused payment. Within days, he left his land and moved to Lincolnshire, saying only, "The ground won't keep still there." Through 1912, occasional travellers recorded peculiar impressions in their journals. A London botanist cataloguing wetland flora wrote of hearing faint music near the church ruins. A woman's voice, maybe 2 humming a hymn I did not recognize. Another visitor, an amateur photographer, developed a plate showing the outline of the church interior. At the edge of the frame, faint and blurred, stood what appeared to be 3 figures, 2 in pale garments facing forward, 1 darker standing behind with his head bowed. The photographer destroyed the negative after one viewing, claiming the light in the room had been too dim for any exposure at all. The few locals who remained in Holme learned to live alongside the silence. They called the ruin the resting field and kept their children away. Old parishioners still visiting from Ely said the air there had a flavour of stone dust and candle smoke, as if a service were always about to begin. The reeds along the water grew unusually high that year, forming shapes that looked from the road like veiled women standing in a row. Wind through them made a sound like distant breathing. By autumn, the district council struck Holme from its ledgers entirely, redistributing its land under another parish name. Nothing remained of the Merrin farm, and St. Agnes was left to collapse into itself. Yet shepherds driving through the fields after dark continued to tell the same quiet story, that if one stood still long enough, one could hear faint footsteps circling the church foundation, 3 sets, always together, never out of rhythm. By the year 1913, Holme had become less a place and more a cautionary tale whispered in border villages. Farmers referred to the area simply as the Hollow, a stretch of land where tools rusted faster and milk soured overnight. A new clergyman from Wisbech, Reverend Linton, was briefly assigned to oversee the now defunct parish lands. His surviving journal, discovered decades later in diocesan storage, contains entries that began with optimism and ended in fear. In April he wrote, "I intend to document the site to separate fact from myth. Faith demands truth, not legend." By June his tone had changed. "I hear the bell though the tower is gone. It tolls once faintly from the direction of the marsh. I find no clapper when I search." That summer, while walking near the old churchyard boundary, Linton discovered what appeared to be fragments of human bone in the churned peat, small, delicate, and partially calcified. He recorded the find carefully, but concluded they were remnants of an earlier burial ground. The county coroner agreed without inspection. The bones were returned to the soil. Yet Linton continued to visit the spot daily, always at dusk. His journal's last dated page reads, "The ground hums beneath my boots, like a voice below water." In the same year, a local teacher named Mrs. Allen gathered folklore from surrounding villages for a school project. Her notebook, now preserved in the Cambridge Folklore Archive, contains several versions of the twin brides of Holme. In each retelling, two sisters vanish after marrying the same man. In some, they drown themselves in the fen. In others, they are sealed beneath a church floor. The one detail that never changed was the final image. They walk still holding hands, with a man behind them carrying no shadow. Mrs. Allen noted that older storytellers spoke the lines as though reciting prayer rather than fable. Meanwhile, a brief notice appeared in a London paper. Surveyor missing in the fens, Mr. J. Pierce, of Huntingdon, failed to report after visiting drainage sites near the former parish of Holme. Authorities, suspect misadventure in swamp terrain. Pierce's sketchbook was found, weeks later, by children playing near a ditch. Among topographical drawings was a single unsettling sketch of two veiled women standing before an archway with the inscription, St. Agnes, 1901. No explanation followed. By the end of that year, Reverend Linton had left his post without resignation. The church registry lists only a marginal note. Clergyman absented himself, believed departed abroad. Yet his boots, coat and Bible were discovered inside the rectory, neatly placed beside the hearth. The rectory's back door was locked from within. Villagers said that after his disappearance, the nights grew quieter than before, so silent that one could hear the fen water moving miles away. A farmer named Aldridge claimed that at certain hours he could still hear soft footsteps circling the place where the church once stood. 3 sets, he said, echoing the older accounts, 2 light, 1 heavy, all keeping the same pace. When investigators returned years later, they found the site nearly consumed by moss and water. What had once been home was now a low meadow rippled with reeds. The air carried no scent of decay, only the faint sweetness of old wood and something else, something like rose petals, long dried but never gone. By the spring of 1914, Holme was no longer named in parish rolls. Yet travellers through the fen still spoke of a church that appeared and vanished with the fog. These accounts, dismissed as tricks of reflection, began circulating in rural newspapers after a photographer named Daniel Pratt claimed to have captured the ruins in daylight. His glass plate showed a modest stone chapel standing intact amid reeds, yet when he returned days later to verify the location, he found only marshland. Pratt's affidavit, notarized in Ely, stated, "The image could not have been a mirage. The detail of carving and window tracery was precise." The authorities filed it under optical irregularity. Around the same time, a group of railway labourers constructing drainage channels nearby reported hearing what sounded like a wedding hymn, drifting across the water at dawn. "It came from no direction," one wrote, "as though sung beneath the ground." Their foreman ordered the crew to move operations west, avoiding the marsh entirely. 2 of those men later swore that the tune returned whenever they worked alone. The following month, a sealed parcel arrived at the diocesan office in Peterborough with no return address. Inside were 2 pressed rose petals, brittle with age, and a note written in a delicate hand, "They are not gone. The vows hold." The envelope was stamped from Huntingdon, but bore no signature. The archivist who opened it fainted, and was later treated for shock, though she refused to say why. The parcel was stored in a locked cabinet, and has since been lost. In July, Europe drifted toward war, and attention turned elsewhere. Many who might have remembered Holme enlisted or left for factory work. Yet in the quiet months before the fighting began, a final witness appeared, a cartographer named Henry Vale, tasked with updating fenland boundaries. His journal describes the ruined parish with a detached precision, remains of church barely visible, foundation stones sunk. 2 upright pillars of masonry still stand, resembling figures in veil. But a later entry, dated August 5th, adds something stranger. "Heard laughter behind me, though the plain was empty. Turned to see 3 shadows against the horizon. The middle one moved first." Vale's map, preserved in the county archives, shows an unmarked symbol, 3 small crosses drawn side by side, where Holme once stood. It was his last recorded project. He died during service in France 2 years later. The mark remained on regional maps until the 1930s, when it was quietly erased. As for the local memory, it never entirely vanished. Travellers continued to report flickering lights above the wetlands, twin glows that seemed to hover and fade, followed always by a dimmer third. Old fen folk refused to name them. When pressed, they would simply cross themselves and say, "Some vows aren't made to end, even now." On windless nights, when the mist thickens low over the reeds, the sound of a bell, one hollow, mournful note, sometimes carries across the fen. Those who hear it say it feels less like sound and more like memory returning. By late 1914, the war had swallowed England's attention, yet a handful of soldiers stationed in training camps across Cambridgeshire began writing home about a strange patch of land near the old fen tracks. Letters collected decades later describe their experiences in eerily similar words. One private, Thomas Ray, told his sister, "We bivouacked near a sunken meadow, where the fog rises out of the soil like smoke from a chimney. There's a bell sound at dusk, one toll, no echo. The men joke it's a lost church. But I dreamt 2 women stood watching us from the water's edge, veils soaked and heavy. Another recruit reported seeing candlelight far across the plain, twin points of flame followed by a dim third, moving slowly as though carried by unseen hands. Officers dismissed the accounts as nerves. Yet for several nights, patrol logs record soldiers refusing to take routes that passed within a mile of home. Back in Peterborough, a civil clerk named Whitcomb, tasked with sorting remaining parish archives before wartime storage, found fragments labelled Holme, 1901-1905. Among them was the faded marriage record Reverend Harcourt had once locked away. It was half-burned, but one phrase survived, "Witnessed beneath the eye of God and earth alike." Whitcomb noted in his margin, "Ink altered. Beneath the lens, faint lines reveal names written twice." He never explained that last remark. Within weeks, his office was requisitioned for military use, and the home papers were transferred elsewhere and subsequently lost. That winter, flooding struck the fenlands, drowning acres of farmland. When the waters receded, scavengers searching for salvage reported the shape of a roof emerging briefly from beneath the current, its stones slick and black. One described arched windows still holding light as though a service carried on below. By morning, the structure was gone. In nearby March, railway porters unloading relief supplies noticed 2 women in outdated dresses, standing on the platform at dawn. They spoke to no one, purchased no tickets, and vanished before the first train departed. The station master recalled their veils dripping water, though it hadn't rained. Their description, identical height, pale features, lace gloves, was later recorded in the local constable's notebook, but struck through with the words "no further inquiry." Even amidst the turmoil of war, such fragments accumulated. A nurse tending the wounded in Huntingdon claimed a delirious soldier muttered repeatedly, "They followed him into the ground," before dying. A parish messenger delivering aid wrote in his log, "The fen path near home impassable by cart. Wheels sink though ground appears solid. Smells faintly of roses." By early 1915, the army erected a temporary depot miles away from the site. During construction, workers found 2 small rings embedded in the mud near a culvert. Both were identical, initials nearly erased. The foreman kept them in his coat pocket for luck. Weeks later, he was crushed beneath a collapsed beam. The rings disappeared from his effects inventory. The military left home off all official maps thereafter. For practical reasons, they said, the ground too soft, too unstable for movement of men or machines. Yet one engineer later admitted, "We could never drive a stake there." The soil pushed everything back out. And still, when the fog rolled low, distant watchers swore they saw a faint outline of St. Agnes rise from the marsh like breath from cold glass, 2 white figures by its gate, and one dark behind them, head bowed in silence. By the spring of 1915, the fenlands were marked by the echoes of artillery training from distant fields. Yet in home the silence persisted, heavier, thicker, as though it absorbed sound itself. Soldiers quartered near the marsh refused to stand watch past sundown. One corporal's report, filed but never officially archived, mentioned unfamiliar bells tolling under the ground and mist that glows faintly in pairs. His captain dismissed the note as nerves brought on by fever, but others quietly confirmed hearing the same hollow resonance drifting through the still air at dusk. That same year, an officer named Captain Beresford rode through the area while mapping alternate supply routes. He stopped at what he believed was solid meadowland to rest his horse, but found his boots sinking into the mud. Nearby he noticed fragments of stone set in a circular pattern, partly submerged. and the faint outline of an arched doorway beneath the surface. He described it in his field diary, a ruin revealed in water, perfect symmetry as if built yesterday then drowned. He took a sketch before riding on. The sketch remains preserved in a military ledger, marked only area restricted, no further survey. By midsummer, letters from civilians once again began mentioning the site. A railway telegrapher wrote to his cousin, "Every time the fog comes I hear a wedding march far off, and it fades before the last note." In Huntingdon's small museum, a caretaker found an unmarked crate delivered without record. Inside were 3 items: a rusted lantern, a woman's shoe damp with fen mud, and a Bible open to the line, "What God hath joined together, let not man put asunder." The crate was labelled Holme. No sender was ever identified. When word of these strange deliveries reached the local paper, editors debated whether to publish. One recalled that the Peterborough Chronicle, in its last known piece on the fens, had written of unions that echo beyond the soil. The parallel was too haunting to ignore, yet war news took precedence. The story was never printed. In September, a small fire broke out near the marsh edge where the Merrin farmhouse once stood. Locals claimed it began from nowhere and burned blue for hours before vanishing without smoke. Soldiers sent to investigate reported the scent of roses and a faint humming like women's voices carried by the wind. One swore he saw 2 pale shapes moving within the haze, each turning toward a darker figure standing apart. He refused further duty and was transferred east. As the year waned, the government drained parts of the fen for defence works, but Holme remained untouched, a patch labelled unstable terrain. Engineers avoided it not from superstition, they said, but because every peg driven into its soil shifted loose overnight. Maps redrawn that winter showed no trace of St. Agnes or the Merrin farm, only open marshland. Yet even without walls or steeple, locals insisted they could still sense the church beneath their feet. When fog gathered thick enough, a low vibration passed through the ground, steady, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. They said it came from the direction of the vanished nave. And when the sound stopped, all that followed was quiet, too complete to belong to nature. When the spring of 1916 arrived, war still echoed faintly across the countryside, but the fenlands of Holme remained untouched, as though time there refused to move forward. Locals claimed the marsh never fully thawed that year. The water lay still and silver, unbroken by birds or wind. One farmer noted in his ledger, "The air tastes of iron near the old ground. Horses won't drink from the ditch that runs through it." His words, like many before, were disregarded as folklore, though the same account appears later in county agricultural notes, listed under unexplained stagnation. In April, an army surveyor revisiting the region for soil measurements stumbled upon remnants of the old parish boundary. His field book describes a shallow trench filled with flat stones laid too orderly to be natural. When pried up, they revealed a layer of compacted ash and fragments of charred ribbon. He collected one sample and delivered it to his commanding officer, who ordered it discarded. The next night, according to his tentmates, the surveyor woke screaming that someone was knocking on the ground beneath me. He was transferred the following week. That summer, a local widow named Mary Holton moved into a small cottage built near what was once the Merrin farm. In letters to her sister, she described finding thin white flowers blooming from dry soil where nothing else grows. She also mentioned seeing 2 women walking near the edge of the marsh at twilight, their skirts unsoiled though the ground was mud. Neighbours dismissed her account, until one evening they saw lights flicker through her window, though she swore she'd long since blown out her lamps. Days later, she left the cottage without notice. Her belongings were found intact, her bed unmade, her boots clean by the door. The war's strain meant few had patience for tales from forgotten villages. Yet one local journalist, Edward Price, attempted to document Holme's fading legend for the Fenland Gazette. His manuscript, never published, survives in fragments. He wrote, "It is said the earth here keeps count. 3 steps follow every traveller who dares cross the marsh at night. 2 light, 1 heavier. The sound is measured, patient, and ends only when the listener stops." Price vanished before submitting the article. His bicycle was found lodged in reeds beside the old church road. Meanwhile, maps continued to omit Holme, its territory now labelled Floodplain Reserve. A military engineer reviewing land claims noted that every attempt to dig near the marked coordinates failed. The soil shifted, as though hollow beneath. "Ground gives a pulse when struck," he wrote. "Not echo, but resistance, like knocking on a coffin lid." By autumn, the war drew closer. Refugees and wounded soldiers occasionally crossed the region, leaving no permanent mark. Yet one chaplain recorded an entry that captures the heart of the story even decades later. "Passing through the marsh, I heard bells that were not there. The wind carried no sound, yet I felt the tolls inside my chest. It was not grief, it was recognition." After that winter, no further reports came from home. The land reclaimed itself under frost and silence. Only when the mist rolls in from the east does the outline of St. Agnes seem to rise again, two faint shapes at its gate, and one dark behind them, keeping eternal watch. By early 1917, the war had nearly drained England of both men and patience. The government turned its attention to rebuilding, while the forgotten villages of the fen, Holme chief among them, sank deeper into obscurity. Yet through scattered journals and small parish notes, faint traces of its story survived. An officer from the Royal Engineers, stationed briefly in the region, wrote in his daily report, "A low hum rises from the marsh at dawn. My compass falters near the coordinates marked H. No sign of habitation, only the foundation of what might have been a church. When I step closer, the water stills as if listening." That same month, a nurse travelling to Peterborough on leave stopped at an inn along the Fen Road. She recorded overhearing two locals say, "Men speaking of a field that rings on," claimed his grandfather warned that anyone who heard the single bell tone was counted among the vanished before a year had passed. She dismissed it as folklore, but later added in her own note, "The following night I dreamt of two brides walking ahead of me in white, and a man turning back to watch. Meanwhile, the diocesan office began organising remaining church property records. The clerk assigned to Holmes' ledger described the pages as water-stained. Entries doubled as though the hand hesitated between two names. He made a copy and filed it separately, labelling it duplicate, origin unclear. The duplicate has never been found. In April, a group of soldiers repairing telegraph poles near the fen stumbled upon an exposed section of stone foundation. One man reached down to test its firmness and struck something hollow. They uncovered what appeared to be a bricked passageway, sealed long ago. The air emerging from it was dry and cold. Inside they glimpsed wood fragments and something white, perhaps cloth. Before they could clear the debris, their lieutenant ordered the pit reburied, noting unidentified structure of ecclesiastical origin. That line, in official archives, is the last mention of any excavation near Holme. Later that year, a flood swept through the lower marshes, erasing what little remained above ground. Survivors who passed through claimed to see floating debris shaped like arches and crossbeams. One woman, a refugee bound for Ely, said she saw two veiled figures standing waist-deep in water, facing east. The military rescue crew who followed her route found nothing, no footprints, no debris, only the reflection of their own lanterns moving across the still surface. In the autumn of 1917, the Peterborough Chronicle, revived briefly as a wartime supplement, printed an anonymous letter from a former parishioner of Holme. It read, "The vows were never broken, only buried. They return each spring when the fog is thick enough to hide their shame." It was the Chronicle's final issue before paper shortages forced its closure. After the armistice, few returned to that part of the fen. The mapmakers erased the name Holme for good, calling it Lowfield. Yet fishermen on nearby waters continued to claim that at certain tides, when the reeds bend in one direction, the outline of a church roof appears just beneath the surface, its bell tower swaying like a shadow in the current. Those who lingered to watch said they sometimes heard a faint voice carried on the wind, neither prayer nor song whispering the same phrase again and again, "We were promised." By 1918, the last official reference to Holme had been filed away in a civil engineer's map ledger, marked simply with a dash where a village name should have been. The war ended, and the soldiers who had camped near the marshes returned home, or those who could. Among their possessions were scattered notes, pocket diaries and sketches. Many referenced the hollow parish, and drawings of a half-sunken chapel framed by two indistinct figures. None bore the name Holme, Yet the coordinates matched exactly where St. Agnes once stood. That same year, an academic from London, Dr. Clement Ross, took it upon himself to document lost parishes of the fen. In his field notes he wrote of the eerie uniformity of reports surrounding Holme. "Every witness speaks of twin presences," he observed, "their likeness perfect, their silence complete. The third form behind them never described in full, only a sense of being watched." Ross cross-referenced his findings with the Peterborough Chronicle, calling it the only extant thread linking myth with registry. He never published his research. The final entry in his notebook reads, "If I stand still, the ground begins to breathe. It feels like waiting." During that winter, a shepherd passing through the lower marsh told a story that would echo across generations. He claimed he saw a faint light near the flooded edge and followed it, thinking it a lantern dropped by travellers. Instead, he found two women standing knee-deep in the water, veils floating like mist. They turned to him slowly, faces pale but clear, and behind them a tall figure leaned against the remains of a wall, half hidden by fog. "He looked right at me," the shepherd said, and the air went still as if the fen had forgotten to breathe. When he fled, the light followed for several paces before fading. He never returned to that stretch again. Folklorists later visiting the site collected similar testimonies, each describing the same triad of figures, the same oppressive silence and a lingering scent of roses. One researcher remarked that the stories always included details too precise for invention. The hem of a dress marked by waterline, the sound of a single bell before dawn, the impression of 3 sets of footprints in the peat. The prints, when photographed, appeared side by side, the deeper one in the center. By 1920, reclamation work had begun along the fen's edge, yet crews avoided the sector once bearing Holme's name. Engineers blamed soft ground and faulty drainage, but rumors spread that machines stalled there for no mechanical reason. Workers reported hearing knocking beneath their boots, 3 steady taps followed by silence. Supervisors dismissed it as trapped air in the soil, though some swore it sounded deliberate, almost polite. Even decades later, the area remained curiously unsettled. Farmers said no crops took root there. Birds flew around the perimeter rather than across it. Local children who strayed too near returned pale and trembling, saying they'd seen ladies in white who didn't move. Adults forbade them from speaking of it. Yet on certain nights, when the fog stretched unbroken from horizon to horizon, faint echoes of a church hymn still carried across the reeds, thin, wavering and incomplete, as though sung from beneath the earth. And each time the last note faded, the fen fell silent again, holding its breath. By 1921, the last survey of the Cambridgeshire fens recorded the marsh once called Holme as non-arable, reclaimed water. No buildings, no graves, no traces of cultivation, only reeds and silt where once a church had stood. Yet the men who worked that ground returned to their lodgings, whispering of shapes seen at dawn. 2 veiled women standing motionless near the water's edge, and behind them a taller figure, hat in hand, watching. They claimed it was not illusion but presence, real as their own breath in the cold. An archivist in Peterborough, tasked with finalizing diocesan losses, reopened what little remained of the parish record. Between the ledgers, he found a folded note written in ink, faded, almost invisible. It read, "We were 3 bound before man and God. None went unwilling." There was no signature, only a faint stain where wax had once sealed it. The archivist, unsettled, filed it away without comment and never returned to that cabinet again. When the Peterborough Chronicle was reprinted in fragments for academic study decades later, one marginal annotation caught attention. In Holme there was a wedding that never ended, only deepened. Scholars dismissed it as the romanticism of an overzealous editor, yet the handwriting matched earlier clerical records, possibly the final words of Reverend Harcourt himself. By 1923, floods erased what was left of the boundary ditches. Fishermen began calling the water their bride's mirror, because on calm mornings, the reflection of the sky showed the faint outline of an arched window beneath the surface. Some said that when the light hit just right, the glass glimmered as though candlelight moved within. Others claimed the sound of a single bell could still be heard before storms. A single, deliberate toll. One traveller passing through that year, a railway inspector named Field, kept a terse diary entry after losing his way in the fog. The reeds part like curtains, I saw a roof beneath the water and 3 shadows above it. They stood so still I thought they were statues until one turned her head. He made it back to the road at dawn, his boots soaked in black water. He refused to describe more. Over time, the land forgot the name Holme. Maps drew clean lines where its marsh once breathed. Yet among archivists and field historians, its legend endured, not as ghost story but as a record of something unquiet in history itself, a case that would not settle into the comfort of ending. The Peterborough Chronicle remained its only factual anchor, each mention of the Merrin name surrounded by ink blots, as though even paper resisted clarity. Those who have walked the fen at night, decades and generations later, speak of a feeling that rises from the ground, a rhythm beneath the soil steady as a heartbeat. They say if you wait long enough the mist parts and you glimpse them, 2 figures in bridal lace pale against the reeds, and a man standing behind, expression unreadable. When the fog closes again, all falls silent, but the air smells faintly of roses and cold stone. And so the story ends where it began, with a marriage that became a legend, a church that sank without ruin, and vows whispered beneath the weight of water and time, forever unanswered, forever waiting in the quiet heart of the fen.